The ongoing civil war in Sudan, much like any other civil war, is a story of two massive dicks engaged in a really inconvenient dick measuring competition. The two dicks in question here are this lovable prankster on the left, Al Burhan, who is the current president and leader of the Sudanese military, and this goofball here on the right is Hemeti, the vice president and leader of the Sudanese paramilitary, which I'll refer to as RSF. Now, the history between these two spans more than a decade of bloodshed and violence, and it starts in the mid 2000s where these guys met on a League of Legends lobby and then decided to commit atrocities in West Sudan. It's been alleged that as many as 300,000 people were killed and 2.7 million people displaced by their actions. For their next trick, they joined forces again many years later in a series of coups, the first against the former president Bashir in 2019, and the next against the former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok in 2021. After this, they essentially established themselves as the rulers of Sudan. And you'd think that after almost more than a decade of working together in perfect harmony with such great synergy, teamwork, and communication, these two would be the best of friends. That's definitely what I thought. Like the level of the scale and level of the atrocities they committed is truly impressive. But to my dismay, I found out that there's actually been some beef brewing between these two. Apparently, something to do with betraying all of your friends and allies somehow sowed distrust in their relationship, which I honestly think is super immature, and these guys really need to get back to being mates ASAP. That being said, yep, that's exactly what happened. Distrust between the two caused Al Burhan to decide to merge the RSF with the army, which would essentially render Hemeti redundant, and potentially he just didn't like his redundancy package or something, because several months later, in the middle of April, fighting broke out between the two military forces. It started out in the capital city of Sudan, Khartoum, and has since expanded to engulf the entirety of Sudan. And I think this footage taken by The Guardian shows like the level of destruction that's ongoing in Khartoum. You can see all of this used to be residential areas has just been reduced to rubble. I think this is a pretty good resource as well by the BBC. It's a little bit outdated, but it shows the locations of where the fighting is ongoing in Khartoum. The main point to drive home is that this is all densely populated civilian living area. Civilians live here, civilians eat here, and civilians have been caught in the crossfire here. And so it's very much a dangerous situation for those living in Khartoum, and of course in any other city in Sudan where fighting is occurring. Another massive issue, besides just the pure outright violence, is the food and water shortages that are occurring as a result of the civil war. Not only is the violence causing damage to key infrastructure, which is leaving civilians without running water and electricity, but vendors shut down, and those that are still open are offering food at extremely inflated prices. And key food imports from neighboring countries, along with the UN aid, has been suspended. You can imagine you're not going to get any Uber Eats deliveries in an active war zone, much like you're probably not going to get sugar from Chad if you really need it in an active war zone. So all of this has led to a fair bit of international interest, with the US, UN, and UK all very much interested in there being an agreement for ceasefire between the two parties, the two warring parties in Sudan. And these ceasefires have all had varying levels of failures. All have faltered at some point and led way to more violence and more aggression, and there's just very little prospects for peace in the future. As of the 29th of April, at least 512 people have been killed from the violence, and 4,200 wounded from the fighting that began on April 15th. And so it's a very dire circumstance for those living in Sudan right now, which again leads us to the question, what do people do in the face of such violence? How do they respond, and what alternatives do they have? Well, to me it seems fairly obvious, although fairly heartbreaking. The obvious choice to me is to flee, and that's sort of what a lot of Sudanese people have done. or are in the process of trying to do. And while that sounds easy to do, it's much easier said than done. Those who have managed to flee did so on the few buses that are still operating through the city, or on any passenger vehicles that are still functioning despite the violence. When they board those vehicles, it's not as easy as just driving out of the city. Many have been met with the violence. Many have, entered into the crossfire between the two military forces. Many RSF military personnel have been aggressive, looting, bribing, robbing, injuring those who try and flee. And so, it's a very difficult task to leave Khartoum itself. And once you've left Khartoum, the journey doesn't really end there. In fact, it's really at the very beginning. You'll find yourself, once you leave Khartoum, in the center of what is a very, very large country. And depending on the choice, regardless of the choice you make, whether it's going north to Egypt, west to Chad, south to Sudan, or east to Ethiopia, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers of war-torn land to traverse across. And at the end of it, there is fairly dishearteningly low chance of actually being accepted across the border in your country of choice, which makes the entire thing the entire journey extremely dangerous and potentially very unrewarding. Now, I want to talk briefly about those who have been successful in fleeing Sudan, those refugees who have made it across the borders. You can see in this infographic by the UNHCR, the major groups are those who have fled to Chad, and that group is from West Sudan, those who have made it to the Central African Republic, and those who have made it to Egypt. I want to specifically look at this group of 20,000 people, the estimated 20,000 people who have made it to Chad, and just analyze their situation very briefly, because although they have have escaped the violence and have managed to make it to relative safety and shelter, their problems are far from over. Chad is an extremely impoverished country. 42% of its population live below the poverty line, and in 2022, it was expected that around 2.1 million people would starve during the lean season. And the lean season, if you didn't know, is a 3-month period in Chad that occurs between harvests, where there's just very little food stock available. And so what the UN expects is that in the coming weeks, the number of refugees that are going to Chad is going to swell to as much as 270,000. And this is just weeks before lean season is set to start. Now, in the absence of these refugees, around 1.9 million people were likely going to starve, or were likely going to be food insecure, I should say, actually. Now, with the influx of an additional 270,000 people, we're already starting to see a little bit of unrest occurring in Chad, where the price of sorghum per kilo has jumped by 50% within a week. And this is just with the 20,000 people that have managed to make it to Chad. So you can imagine as more refugees come into Chad, the price of food is going to skyrocket, the demand is going to skyrocket, and the supply is just not going to be available to feed these people. And so while these people have found relative, and I emphasize very relative safety in Chad, and have managed to escape the Sudanese violence, the problems of food shortages and water shortages is still a very much ongoing threat. And so this is sort of where we come in. I'm assuming majority of us don't have Al-Bahan or Hermeti's personal phone numbers in our contact list, and can't just ring them up, call them cunts, and tell them to be mates again. I think the only real way we can make a difference as a collective is, one of two ways is to either donate to the UNHCR, which I think is a pretty good resource. It's where I got majority of my information from for this video, and so I think they likely have pretty quality. They offer good quality welfare to these people. And the other alternative is to spread the word. And I think this also can be very powerful. Having a conversation with your mates, your parents, your teachers, spreading the word so that more people are inclined to be generous and donate, or so that governments themselves can step in and take action. These are all, I think, fairly effective ways of just helping out with the cause, and I highly recommend it if you want to do it. Up to you. Cool. So I hope you enjoyed the video, or maybe didn't enjoy it, but hope you found it interesting. I definitely found the topic very, very interesting and fairly heartbreaking, and I just thought it was important to talk about and spread the word a little bit. Yep. See you in the next video. Cool. See ya.